Good afternoon. My name is Umi Hankins, and I'm with the National Institute on Health and I'm sorry, I'm with the National Institute on Healing and on Transformation, and I'd like to welcome everyone here today. Today, we're going to start the first part of our two-part webinar series on the Legal Network for Gender Equality webinar series on Black women survivors of workplace sexual harassment and sexual violence. So today will be the first part, and then the second part will take place on March 5th, the same time, from 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. So we really want to welcome you to our event today, to the webinar today. I had a little bit of a crisis just before starting, so if I sound a little... Are we having a little problem there? Well, one thing I do know about doing webinars is if it's possible to go wrong, it will go wrong. So we always have to be a little bit on the market there for saying, if it goes wrong, we'll get together and we'll come back and start right in with it again. So we appreciate your patience as things could possibly happen that way. As I was saying, I had a little bit of an emergency right before I got on the phone, so I am a little bit behind in getting this together, but we will catch up and get started. So again, welcome, and the Legal Network for Gender Equality is helping to sponsor this today. I will give you the other sponsors for the event just a little bit later in the presentation, so I will get started with that. But I want you to know that we have an esteemed, high-quality panelists today that will be joining us. And each one has tremendous expertise in their field. And we have Jaribu Hill, who will be joining us. We have Tanya Lovelace and Karma Cotman, and then also Condencia Braid. And again, my name is Umi Hankins. Their full bio will be distributed a little bit later, and so you will be able to look at their wonderful qualifications and the work that they've done in the field. We want you to know that each person will take some time and be able to do a presentation for you, but at the same time, we're interested in any questions that you may have and would like to ask of us. And so we make sure that we save some time at the end for you to do that. But at any time during the presentation, please feel free to type your questions in your chat box. And so mine is on the right-hand side of my screen. I hope that's where yours is also, or that you're aware of where your chat box is. So please feel free to add any questions or comments that you would like to make, and we will make sure and respond to them. All right, so this is exciting. This is a wonderful topic, representing Black women survivors of workplace sexual harassment and sexual violence, an introduction. So that is the one that we're starting today. Part 2 will be March 5th. Our first presenter that is going to come for us today is going to provide us with some background information, some historical context on the racial issues that exist for Black women in our communities. And so we want to lay that foundation to make sure that we understand how is it that we got to where we are in understanding the racism and injustice that Black women face, both in the workplace and in their communities. So, Jaribu, could you please join us and start your presentation?
Sure. History and context tell the story of body as property, body as bondage, skin for the taking. From 1619 until the end of the peculiar institution of slavery, enslaved women were forced to be house servants, mammies, cooks, and field hands. These were the miserable realities women in bondage faced: rampant sexual exploitation, habitual beatings and rapes, to serve as long-term concubines who often were loaned out to provide sexual services to their owners' family members and friends, forced to breed for profit as they watched their children sold off to other plantations, forced to live lives that were in total destruction, forced to watch their families completely and totally destroyed, their children sold off to other masters away from the plantation where they were. Slave masters had no legal obligation to respect the sanctity of the slave's marital bed. As property, enslaved women, married or single, had no protection against their owners' advances or assaults on their persons. Now, the slide that I prepared has a collage, a border collage going around the particular dates that I've pointed out to you, the years that I'm going to discuss with you briefly. And I wanted to highlight some of those images for you as I get deeper into my brief presentation. First of all, we show workers demonstrating against the corporate powers, such as the example up in the top left-hand corner where you see workers who are protesting against the war that they see that has been made upon workers by big companies like Walmart. Next to them, you see workers who are taking on the fight for a living wage, better known as the fight for 15. You see poultry and catfish workers. You see Fannie Lou Hamer in the right-hand corner with the megaphone speaking to the crowd about voting rights, civil rights, and human rights in the Mississippi Delta and across the country. And you see Ella Baker, a stalwart freedom fighter. You see the image of Lena Baker, who I'm going to talk about in a couple of moments. But these are images that were selected so that you get a flavor and a feel for the kinds of abuses that Black women have suffered for centuries, beginning with 1619. And of course, we just celebrated or commemorated rather the 100th anniversary of 1619. And many people traveled to Ghana so that they could be a part of the memory and the remembering of our ancestors. In 1944, Reese Taylor, and her image is part of the collage, was kidnapped in rural Alabama. It happened on September 3rd, that she was traveling home with friends and family members leaving church and was gang raped by 6 white men. Despite the men's confessions to the authorities, 2 grand juries subsequently declined to indict the men. No charges were ever brought against her rapist. With the help of Rosa Parks and countless other Black women and concerned community residents, Reese spoke up and fought for justice. In 1945, Lena Baker never had a chance. Born into poverty, born woman, assigned to live and work in slavery after the emancipation. She lived as property, not as human. On the fateful day when she resisted the brute force of her white boss's advances and shot him to death, self-defense would not be an acceptable defense. For killing her rapist, Lena Baker was convicted of murder, and on March 5th, 1945, was executed by the state of Georgia. Pardons and apologies have been made decades later, much too late. In the latter part of the 20th century, in 1985, in Laurel, Mississippi. Laurel, Mississippi is known as a safe haven for the Klan and other hate mongers. Located in Jones County, Laurel is the home of Sanderson's Farm Post. Gloria Jordan, a courageous Black labor leader, joined with other Black and white Sanderson's Farm poultry workers to stand against sexual and racial harassment in the plant. They told stories as we met with them when we organized fundraisers and support sessions for these sisters. They told stories of white male supervisors rubbing up against them and getting erections and whispering dirty talk into their ears and forcing them into sexual alliances or sexual liaisons, which were not consensual, but were part of the whole tradition and history of rape at work. So for decades, they were exposed to these unspeakable crimes against their bodies and against their persons, against their selves. And finally, in 1985, they walked out of Sanderson's farm without a union, without any protection. They staged a dignity walkout to expose the decades of unwanted touching, sexual assault, retaliation, and discrimination. Now we come to the 21st century, but before we do that, we understand that there has been a history of resistance to all of the examples that I have just laid out for you and all of the years that I've set out in this particular slide: 1619, 1944, 1945, 1985, and we're getting ready to talk about the 21st century. But there has been a history of resistance since the very first slave ship docked on these shores, known as the shores of the United States. There's been resistance since the very beginning, since the very first slave ships came. As soon as the abductions began, as soon as the trade began, Black women, descendants of Harriet, have always resisted the trade, the theft of womb and soul. Black women, descendants of Harriet, have always suffered in silence until it was time to be loud, and then watch out for the early courage of Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, Anna J. Cooper, Pauli Murray, Mary McLeod Bethune, Phyllis Wheatley, and for the 20th century courage of Lena Baker, Desi Woods, Gloria Jordan, and so many, many others. We must Fannie Lou Hamer, the 6th grade scholar, and Mary Moultrie and Louise Brown, who led the 1969 Charleston, South Carolina hospital workers strike. And they too suffered from sexual harassment and unwanted touching and abuse, both verbal and physical. And they stood against those indignities, and they marched for better wages, for equal treatment and respect in the workplace. We know that that resistance lasted 111 days. And we also are in gratitude to Ida Leachman, leader of the Furniture Workers Union in Memphis, Tennessee, organized with Alzada Clark to support the I Am a Man strike of 1968. For Mary Young of Greenville, Mississippi, who led a strike in a non-union plant for dignity and against sexual harassment and for better wages. And for all of the domestic workers forced to endure physical and sexual abuse, stolen wages, skin iron, chin kicking, brutal beatings and rapes. We know there is a debt to be paid to these sisters because they took their fight to the international stage. They took their fight to the international stage. The work of the 21st century inspires us and lets us know that the resistance movement has never, ever stopped and will not stop until we see an end to the violations and abuses that are described herein today. The work of the 21st century includes, in a resounding way, June 1st, 2011. Because of the courageous Black and brown domestic workers who put everything on the line to expose workplace abuses and the indignities they suffered while trying to make a living, the plight of all domestic workers was brought to the world stage. And on June 1st, 2011, the General Conference of the ILO, the International Labor Organization, enacted the Domestic Workers Convention 2011, number 189. No more rapes on the night shift. No more rapes under the shade and shelter of international immunity. No more theft of wages. No more forced into silence. No more race, class, and gender oppression. Bringing out of the shadows into clear view those who have historically been devalued and set aside. And why this history resonates, why this current history resonates so much with the history of the past is because many of the conditions that Black women experienced in bondage were also experienced by domestic workers in the 20th century. They literally had no say-so over their bodies, over their time, over the way they worked, over the conditions that they worked under. And so out of the shadow, out of the shade, out of the hidden cloak of misogyny and patriarchy and racism and sexism came forth these brave women to put into full view the notion not only of visibility, but of power, the notion of ending body as property, ending skin for the taking, ending body as bondage. And we owe a serious debt to Tawana Burke for the Me Too announcement that she made on behalf of all of us. And because of that, it has leveraged justice for so many women in and outside of the privilege zone. It has leveraged voice and visibility for so many women. And we've been privileged at the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights, founded in 1996, to represent some courageous women in the 20th and 21st centuries who have come forward, stepped up, so that the touching and the grabbing and the fondling and the rape will discontinue and be no longer. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that resounding presentation and for evoking the names of so many women who have laid a pathway and foundation for all of the women that are coming, that have come since them, and that still come after even we're here. Naming our heroes, our sheroes, is important so that we understand and we remember and that we bring forth the power that they laid for us. So thank you very much, Jerusalem, for that presentation.
Thank you.
Next, we want to speak with Tanya Lovelace. Tanya is going to talk to us about the language that we use in coming together and the terminology that we have to use to ensure that we're all on the same page as we're working to ensure justice, racial justice, sexual justice for Black women in our communities. Tanya, could you begin your PowerPoint, please?
Sure. And I will say that, thank you so much, Umi. I don't actually have a slide for this portion, so we can go back to the slide of your picture because I know you'll be speaking right after me. I am going to be speaking a little bit more about language later, but what I want to share here now is how important it is for us to recognize just terminology, for example, in terms of how Black people were spoken of as slaves, when at the same time they were actually enslaved Africans. These were people who were brought from Africa and enslaved. And so the context of using the term slave almost in and of itself is an objectifying term to use. And so I know that it is a term that we've often used, and it's not necessarily intended in that way, but I understand and want to share and emphasize how important it is to continue to infuse humanity into those individuals and being sure to say who they were, They're actually enslaved Africans. They were brought here from their land and engaged and placed into enslavement. A few other things that I want to say is that during a time now in which language is becoming more and more policed, such words as racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, white supremacy, these are words, privilege, these are words that are often tagged as over the top, language that is not often connected to such terms as rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment. But when you're going to be talking about Black women, it's going to be important to make sure that you understand that such language needs to be connected. It needs to be clear that when you're talking about sexual assault and sexual harassment, it has to be talked about within the context of ways in which racism, classism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, white supremacy all overlap and create a web of oppression for Black women. And so I'm going to pass it back to you, Umi, but I did want to just be so clear that you're going to be hearing language that some people have said is old school. Some people have said is radical language. But here, it's really just clear language that Black women grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And we ask you to try it on and embrace this language both during this webinar and also after, so that you're continuing to be truthful in your engagement in talking about Black women and sexual assault and rape. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Umi. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, that's so right that as we talk about terminology and language, that as Black women in the Black community raise these issues, that we're looked at as being very divisive in using words like racism and racial justice, that we're looked at as starting to ruffle feathers, but really it's our everyday life. So understanding and getting used to and being accustomed to hearing these words will bring closer collaborations and better partnerships in working among organizations and working together. So thank you, Tanya, very well. Thank you very much for that. And so before I go into my PowerPoint, I do want to also thank the attorneys who volunteered for the Legal Network for Gender Equality and for all that they do to combat sexual discrimination, including sexual harassment in the workplace. And I want to say thank you as well to our excellent presenters, as they have spoken or will continue to speak throughout this webinar, as well as to Girls for Gender Equality, Equity, and the National Black Workers Center Project for their time and substantive contributions to developing this webinar series. And remember, this is the first of 2 webinars that we will be hosting. The next one, again, March 5th. And thank you to the National Women's Law Center and the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund for supporting the development of this webinar series. We will not take time to describe, as I said, any of the accomplishments of the presenters, but we want to make sure that you have an opportunity later on to look at their bios. All right? And so, and then I want to say thank you for joining us. I see people are continuing to join the webinar, and so we appreciate your coming on, and we want to let you know that there will be an opportunity for us to ask questions. And once we've gone through this information and had a little bit more dialogue between the presenters. So if you could take my presentation to the next slide, please. What is intersectionality? That's what I want to talk about today, because we use this another term, as Tanya was talking about, the language that we use, and intersectionality being one of those things that comes up so much. Could you go to the next slide, please? So in this presentation, I want to look at 2 things basically, and that's how do we use race-based and sex-based discrimination? How do race-based and sex-based discrimination intersect? How do they come together as we look at Black women not being able to separate those 2 things? And what does it mean to take an intersectional approach to addressing workplace sexual harassment and sexual violence? Next, please. So intersectionality is actually a term that was evoked by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw some time ago. And she started using this word in her scholarly efforts to describe what was happening when in communities of color with Black women, as they're not able to say I'm Black or I'm a female to identify their gender. They weren't able to separate those things because what was happening to them, the racism, the events, and the issues that were happening, the political issues that were happening to them, could not be separated. And so it was a matter of oppression. And she coined this term of intersectionality. Next slide, please. So we had a quote from one woman that said, I am a Black woman. I cannot separate my race from my sex. I cannot separate racism from sexism. They are rarely separate, never indivisible. Don't ask me to choose. I cannot. I am myself. I am not you, nor would I let you choose for me. And I think these topics have come up a lot in the work in the field that we've done as we continue to do the work in the field, even as we look at what was thought of as the feminist movement, seeming as though it was a white women's movement. But just as Zaribo just laid out for us, it's clear that it wasn't. But in many cases, it was thought that that was what was happening. And so when it's ignored and when Black women's voices are silenced, then we've had to acknowledge that no, we're more than women, that there's much more to our well-being, to our life, than just saying that we're women. Next slide, please. But even in talking about race, we have to acknowledge that within the Black community, there are many different people who may or may not identify as Black, but who may be recognized as Black. And so we have to make sure that we're looking at the African American, the African immigrant and refugee community, and the African Caribbean or African Latino community, and even those who may who may not identify as Black, but may be identified as Black in their community. Next slide. So we see the diversity, the wealth of the diversity that's in our community, and it's represented. And in that first picture, really, you could look at that and you would not be able to tell if women are from African Caribbean background, from African background. But what we do know is that they appear to be from the African diaspora. And you can see the different ways in which over time and history, what has happened with the interracial mingling of the different groups, then giving us different perspectives in our look. So we have to make sure that as we're talking to women, as we're looking at them, that we let them identify themselves and that we're not labeling and saying, oh, you're African American, and putting labels on people who may appear to be one thing or another, but we may not understand all of their intersectionality. Next slide. We have to do the same thing with gender. And it's really good in the time that we're living now because gender is also on a continuum. And that we have to make sure that we're honoring not only gender when we say male and female, male, man and woman, but that we're including other ways in which communities identify, the trans community, the genderqueer community. We have to make sure that we're respectful and honoring and not, again, applying our labels, but listening to who they are for them to tell their story and to understand what has happened to them and the way that it's happened. Next slide. The genderbread person then outlines more even about our gender identification and our orientation and our expression and our sex. So we get to see the different ways in which anyone can identify, that we just don't say we're male or female, but there are many ways even within our personal sexual orientation and our personal identification that we do identify. And we, again, have to look and know and give people the opportunity to see themselves and to present themselves in the world for who they are. Next slide. So if you would just continue to click, I didn't realize I had put this on a timer. So when we look at, again, this picture of diverse Black women from the African diaspora, then we have to recognize that their ethnic origin needs to be identified. So we can't put race and ethnicity together. Those are two different things. If you would continue to touch this, yeah. So we have race, that's right. Religion and spirituality, age, education, gender, sexual orientation. We have the birthplace, economic class status, and language, history, and disability status. So we can't even say that intersectionality stops at race and gender. We even know that in identifying the intersectionality of individuals, that Angela Davis even had a book and talked about the violence against women from looking at race, class, and gender. But our identification goes beyond race, class, and gender in order for the true contextual experience that we have to be understood. Next slide. And with every way that we identify every one of these intersections, and I also want to say that when we think of intersections, sometimes we think of like the right angle, that, the horizontal intersected with the parallel, and therefore we had at that one point, but that's not the way it is with us. What happens is that every ounce of our body, every molecule, every cell of our body then becomes influenced and impacted by the way in which we experience our lives, our perception of what's happening to us. And so as we look at that, we can't separate and say it's a true intersection. What it is it's a weaving of our experience throughout our lives. And that every one of those points, every one of those issues that we talked about, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, every one of those issues also has a level of oppression that is attached to it. So the more of these things that you identify with, then the more open you are for oppressive situations to be confronted with. Next slide. Next slide. So intersectionality, or the way in which this is wove through our lives, also invokes the issue of privilege versus oppression. So some of us have privilege in our lives, but in the other ways, we are oppressed. Next slide. So as we look at those level of privilege that we experience, we know that white men, white women have more privilege and status than our Black community. But as we look at things like middle and upper class, we do have ways in which Black women also fall into those categories and may have some privilege that they experience as a result of that, or being a Christian, being the mainstream religion, as opposed to being part of Buddhism or being Muslim or other religious backgrounds that you may have. But all of these different ways that are out there, if you have part of this, then that gives you more privilege in order for you to have more safety in your life. But that doesn't protect you, because even as a Black woman and having all of these things, you will fall in a lower category than you would than if you were a white woman or a white man. Next slide, please. And those who are oppressed then have these issues that they're dealing with, that they have to contend with, because this is what oppression does at these intersections for Black women. And Black women experience, Black communities experience more of those than any other community, disproportionately, and have disparate rates that are attached to it. Next slide. So we just have some steps. Black women are at work. Black women have always worked. We've worked in the fields. We've worked in the home. It's not our luxury that we were able to, over time, to be the majority in which we were able to sit home. And so we're still in the market for work. And those are some of the statistics that come with it. Next slide. And young Black women are most likely to be harassed at work. And so as they go to work and they're recognized not only by white men but also by black men, we have to recognize that there's the possibility or the prevalence for black women to experience more of sexual harassment than any other racial group. And this is unfortunate. And with black men also being in that category as posing a threat for black women and harassment and sexual assault, we know that black women are more hesitant in order to speak out against black men for being feared or seen as race traitors of the race, or being one that is colluding with the criminal justice system. But we have to recognize that that is not keeping our black women safe. All right, next slide. Next slide. And so again, this is another study that is talking about racial harassment within our community. So we want to go forth and listen to Tanya again. Tanya?
Yes, can you hear me?
No, not yet. There we go. All right, Tanya, thank you very much.
Yes,
now,
thank
Tanya,
you.
Yeah, and I know that you presented earlier and you did a wonderful job, but tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about this time.
Sure. Hi, I am Tanya Lovelace, and I am the CEO of Women of Color Network, Inc., and pleased to be on this webinar with such amazing orators and presenters and experts on this issue. I am going to be contributing today to talk a bit about some historical context and really understanding the foundation upon which stereotypes and images of Black women and girls really have been laid out, and that we are judged against those contexts, against those stereotypes, and that is what makes us most vulnerable. The reason why we would have greater rates of harassment, of sexual assault, and why we would have great rates of homicide and other issues that Black women experience and Black girls experience. And so if you could please go to the next slide. And to just say briefly that the women of, yes, so so I'll just say here that Women of Color Network really works to end violence against all women by centralizing the voices, the wellness, and the leadership of women of color. And it's a critical point of our work. If you could please pass to the next slide. And so what does the objectification and dehumanization of Black women and girls continue, or how does this continue to manifest in the workplace? Well, I felt that it was important to first lay a context for, what is the legal precedent that really, besides the enslavement of Africans, what was the cornerstone here that really continues to haunt Black communities? And it is in 1787 in which Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution declared that those that African Americans or those who were enslaved counted as 3/5 of a person. And so that context in which we were not seen as human, we were only seen as 3/5 of a human, has really laid the context for Black women and girls to be inherently seen as public property, and as the ownership of their bodies being related to all others outside of themselves, and are therefore fair game. And so there's this context in which Black women's bodies are seen as public property, and it is then seen as easily accessible to everyone, as Umi was mentioning earlier. And that can be related to Black men as well as men and other women of all races, that Black women are often seen as public property and as being able to be touched and manipulated, harassed and raped and mimicked, and so many other pieces. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to also then lay a social justification. There was both the legal justification, but now there is a historic social justification that I want to share. And first, I want to reinforce how important it is to trust and believe Black women when they're talking about themselves and laying out information about themselves. And so critical books that really laid the ground for me in terms of my work and how I began to really dig into this work around violence against women, was really looking at these books that were written, pivotal books that were written by Angela Davis, by Paula Giddings, and by Deborah Gray White, that really spoke to the critical pieces of enslavement and dug deep into that institution, and then began to lay the foundation for how this history and herstory still follows us today. So I just want to reinforce how important it is to read these foundational books. Could you please pass to the next slide. And so within this historic social justification, there was ongoing PR and advertisement work, so to speak, that had been done, well before Twitter, well before social media, in the same way that we look at it now. There had been long time campaign to really justify why slavery could and should exist. And there were 4 prominent caricatures that were honed and developed as a justification for enslavement and the dehumanization and objectification of Black women and girls that still endure today. And so there had already been some mentioning of the mammy. There was this old context in which mammy was seen as a generally a nurturing person, a Black woman with an apron on, with their hair wrapped, in a home, taking care of everybody within the big house. She was perceived as being the happy person, always happy, non-sexual, non-threat to the household, and really seen as nurturing all but everyone in her surroundings, but her own children, but Black children and Black people. Her focus in this way was perceived as being focused upon white people and creating a habitable space for them. This image was intended to reinforce that Mammy was happy. She was fine. She was good in her station within the slavery institution. In the workplace today, if you fast forward to today, there are still Black women that are perceived as being happy-go-lucky, perceived as being a non-threat, perceived as being a nurturer in the space, being perceived as someone that you can tell your secrets to, that you can go and get advice from. And this person is often perceived, or at least it's being portrayed as being non-attractive, and unrapeable, and can't be harassed. And yet, historically, we know and understand that women that would have fallen within the mammy context were sexually harassed, did experience rape, did experience violence. And we do know that there is no context in which any woman who fits any particular stereotype will and can be, who actually would not be, who wouldn't have to still be concerned about her safety and her well-being on a day-to-day basis. And so this is used as myth, but in fact, really Black women of all likeness were experiencing sexual assault and sexual harassment today and in the past. Just as the context of Jezebel, there was a caricature of the Jezebel in which some Black women were perceived as being lewd, as being seductress, as being built for pleasure, as being asked, as asking for it, and really consent to all. And what that really, in that context, was meant to reinforce the idea that Black women were not being raped during the slavery institution, that they actually were seeking this, that they had equal relationships with those that were engaging in rape, and that they were participating in this, and in fact were seductresses and luring white men into engaging in what they would perceive as consensual sex. And then in the workplace today, Black women, many Black women are seen as being a temptress, as being sexy, as being therefore unrapeable and can't be harassed because she is consenting. She is asking for it. So she is not in any way then able to be raped or harassed. And once again, with knowing that and understanding that this is a justification, that in fact, women, no matter how they look, no matter what what they're wearing, no matter how they present, can be and are raped and are sexually harassed. But then moving to Sapphire, there is this old context, this old stereotype that is very much enduring for Black women today. The context of the angry Black woman, that she is too loud, too rude, emasculating. She's a complainer. The idea then that in the current workplace that this is a very enduring context that says that Black women today are complaining about everything, that they are rude, that they are loud, and that they are not credible for that perspective. And then therefore, because they can show up in a way that may be perceived as equal or even as being emasculating to men of all races, that they may be perceived then as being unrapeable and can't be harassed. And yet data shows, and we know that Black women are raped and experience sexual harassment all the time, regardless of their temperament and the way that they show up. And then pickaninny, which was really a phrase that was used often for Black children. The idea that Black children were unkempt, were animalistic, and were often depicted in old books and writings and film as being out there on their own, unsupervised, unmothered, thus falling into the mouths of tigers or getting getting run over on railroad tracks and other kinds of things that really demonstrate this. And so today's context, when I'm looking at Umi's previous stat about young Black women are the most likely to be sexually harassed in the workplace, the idea that they are still seen as wild, as just being out there hanging in the wind with no context and no support, that these are girls who are still perceived as being unrapeable and can't be harassed because once again, they are already wild, they are already out there, and therefore there is no affront that can come to them because they are already public property and they are already animalistic and unsupervised. And so this again lays the historic context. These stereotypes still continue to this day to surround Black women and girls and serve as justification both for rape and sexual assault historically, as well as today used as a justification. Can we please go to the next slide? And so then to go even further, Black women are paid 61 cents on the dollar. But in a country where our labor was free, there is a cycle of unequal pay and then undervalue. So those things usually run together. And so the economic justification is that for Black women that are perceived as mammies, that they are expected, as being non-sexual and non-threat and just sweet and a nurture to all, is also being often perceived as she's there to take care of everyone. So her job is really to not get paid, but to get paid pennies on the dollar, and is still underpaid for what she brings because her value to the work is often overshadowed by what people perceive as their relationship to them and ways that they access those that may fall within this mammy category. In the same way with Jezebel, that if Black women are still perceived as seductresses and built for pleasure and asking for it, then they are also then seen as too sexual to be taken seriously, are then often still underpaid, not promoted, not taken seriously in their work. and their contributions are underplayed or downplayed. The same for Sapphire. If there is this perception of Black women as being angry and loud and rude, and they are too angry to be heard or to be promoted, that they are complainers and that they bring issues to the table too much, they are bucking the system. And because of that, they are perceived as not being able to be promoted and are thus, again, underpaid and undervalued. And then with Pickaninny, you know, the idea that you've got young Black children or well, young Black women walking into, you know, a workplace. And again, if they are perceived as being unkempt, and today it's often their hair, they're attacked for their hair, they're attacked for their clothes, they're attacked for the ways in which they walk into a space. They are also then seen as being too lazy and unreliable. And so because of that, and all the other stereotypes that are attached to Black girls, that they are then underpaid, they are not seen as being promoted, they can't be then managers in their spaces that they're in. And so they're often passed up for opportunities. And so this is how those old contexts still plays out today and still reinforces an economic justification for keeping Black women and girls, quote unquote, in their place. Can we please move to the next slide? And so this also then reinforces stereotypes for trans Black women. It's important to really look at transphobia as yet another justification for why Black transgender women and multiracial transgender women are often perceived in a very particular way. And so what we know is that 33%, and it comes from the 2015 US transgender survey, that 33% of Black transgender women experienced officers assuming that they were sex workers. 20% of Black transgender respondents were unemployed, twice the rate among Black people in the US. So that was twice as many of Black people across the board. And 38% are living in poverty, 42% have experienced homelessness, and 53% have been sexually assaulted. 53% of Black trans women have been sexually assaulted at some point in their life. And some then...
You know, Tanya, these numbers are just outrageous as we look at the trans community, and we understand also how again, trans women are more likely to be assaulted, to be sexually assaulted, and to be physically harmed. So we do need to know that. And we want to move on to talk about the issue of trauma. So as we're talking about all of these things and the way in which these dynamics are happening in each of the communities, we also want to look at the issue of trauma that they're experiencing. So we're going to have a little time for a dialogue a little bit later. Tanya, so maybe we can get back to some of that information at that time. But let's move on and talk about this issue of trauma that Black women are experiencing. Condencia, if you could pull up
can you hear me?
For me, please. Yes, now we can. Condencia, could you share some information?
Okay, that's great.
Tanya talked about all of this. Could you share a little information with us about how Black women are experiencing trauma?
Thank you, and good afternoon or good morning to folks. It's so wonderful to be a part of this important conversation. I want to start off by lifting up, if I don't get through all of my slides, I want to lift up an excellent piece, two pieces. One is, please look at UJIMA, the National Center on Violence in the Lives of Black Women has an excellent piece that talks about sexual assault and the occurrence of violence for Black women. And also, Sasha Center has another excellent piece. It talks about Black women's triangulation and rape, and it is an excellent model that really pulls together so much of what we're talking today. So I want to lift those two up. I want to talk a little bit about the context of sexual assault and sexual harassment. We've been kind of using those two terms, and so I want to kind of set the tone that, when we talk about sexual harassment, oftentimes, we try to think about how does it connect to sexual assault. Well, sexual harassment is not only a civil legal issue and a workplace or educational issue. Sexual harassment is also one form of sexual assault. And we're always careful, those of us that work in sexual assault, not to divorce the issue of sexual harassment from sexual assault, because it takes away from survivors' experience, especially when you are a survivor of a previous sexual assault or child sexual abuse. The context of sexual assault is a violation. It's broad, and it's not always physical, but it's traumatic. It's sexual in nature. It's a violation, even if it's not covered by the state or territorial statute definition of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So I want to kind of lay that context. Next slide. Next slide. So sexual assault, when we talk about sexual assault in Black women, we know that statistics tell us that 1 in 4 Black girls will be sexually abused before the age of 18. We know that a significant number of Black women who are adult survivors, they are adult survivors of childhood sexual assault, particularly generational incest, not because the Black community is any more violent, but because the opportunities to address these issues are often not there. We also know that 30% of Black women with documented histories of childhood sexual abuse were sexually assaulted in adulthood as well. It's important to then recognize that when you're working with a survivor of sexual harassment, you often be working with a Black woman where the sexual harassment is not their first incident or experience of sexual assault. Next slide. Many Black women suffer in silence for years, never sharing with anyone what has happened to them. Thus, the trauma remains unnamed, unknown, and untreated, and the symptoms worsen. Next slide. The narratives that you've heard the other presenters with such important words talk about, the narratives of strong Black women, the angry Black women, and the sexualized Black women impact on a survivor's ability to heal. Research has noted that for Black women, anxiety is more chronic and the symptoms of anxiety are more intense than white women. Often Black women have developed coping mechanisms to address the trauma, some of which may be unhealthy. Next slide. Oh, nope, sorry, stay there. Nope, go back, one slide, please. Black women are asked to be responsible for the behavior of the harm doer, blamed for the assault, and expected to protect the collective Black community. As Black people, we often band together to address the violence that impacts our collective community, but we struggle to address the sexual assault that is committed within our community by our own people. But when we do this, it's at the cost of our Black women and girls. Black women are often unable to get support outside of the community because they're invisible, and inside of their community because it's not their turn. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. Trauma is cumulative. The more traumas people experience, the more traumatized they become. Black people experience more racism than any other group, so it makes sense that we see more traumatization as a result. Next slide. Those of us that work with trauma, we often talk about somatic trauma with the context of what the mind forgets, the body remembers. For Black women, the history of collective community trauma lives in our bodies, and so does the trauma associated with experiences of sexual assault. Next slide. Our strength and our resilience as Black women is a positive legacy, but it can also be twisted and used against us. Black women may get mixed messages, such that strength for Black women across socioeconomics are often trying to get over it. Black women get the sense that we need to keep it moving. We're too busy taking care of family, church, community, etc., to take care of ourselves. Our strength can be misconstrued to mean that Black women don't feel pain and that you don't get to be a victim. In addition, strength can be misconstrued to mean that Black women oftentimes can't lay down their burden. I've heard survivors say to me, I'm a survivor, but I'm also a victim. Can I be a victim today? Can I expose my pain? Can I feel my pain? Can I let my pain show? Who can I tell about my pain that won't judge me? Next slide. Trauma shows up in very different ways. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a mental health condition that can develop after experiencing a traumatic event. Repeated exposure to violence increases the likelihood to develop PTSD, such like repeated exposure to racism. Everyday microaggressions is also traumatic and can also increase a person's risk of developing PTSD. That is then layered onto the incidence of sexual assault that a survivor may have to go through. And it's important to note that sexual assault is one of the most common forms of trauma in the lives of women. It's also important to note that every survivor of sexual assault is different, and their response to trauma will be different and reflect their own lived experiences. Post-traumatic stress disorder can include flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, and uncontrollable thoughts. What we see is that it can show up in terms of difficulty concentrating, including not being able to focus on work, schoolwork. It can further compound an ability to focus and forget small details. It can also show up as minimizing the impact of the sexual assault. I've had worse, I'm fine, I'm okay. It can show up as depression. Depression is a significant issue for many Black women, often untreated and undetected. Hopelessness is another way that it can show up. Oftentimes, especially if you're a survivor of child sexual abuse, there's a sense that no one helped me as a girl child, and no one can help me now. Often survivors have significant chronic pain. Chronic pain is something that is very much associated with Black women. There are many, many Black women that are suffering from chronic pain, often undiagnosed and untreated. When we talk about barriers to help, Black women are often having to face, women of color in general, and especially Black women, are having to face not being able to get support for their chronic pain, needing pain management, but oftentimes being turned away and disregarded as just seeking drugs. What can also show up for many survivors is disassociation. They're there, but they're not really present. For Black women, we oftentimes say and do what is expected of us without any attachment or connection to what is happening. We know what is expected from us in order to get help from systems, so we give them what they want. There can be numbness. Also, a lot of times Black women may say, I'm done, I'm over it. But as we noted before, the unaddressed trauma still lives in the body. It can show up as hyperaggressions, but oftentimes it's not noted because it's associated as being an angry Black woman. Black women can appear cold or rough. We see it can impact on parenting, but instead of getting support, they can be called emotionally distant and labeled through stereotypes. Oftentimes, a Black woman can be hypervigilant, not easy to trust someone. For Black women, being harmed by someone from your own community can seem like a bigger sense of betrayal. There's also a lack of belief that the system is going to work for me. Many Black women may be dealing with various issues of trauma all at once. There's a hierarchy of needs. I need my job, I need my education, I need my immigration status, I need to survive. And survival is what's important. Black women may think, I've survived worse. I've come from a legacy of strong women. I can survive this. It's extremely important to allow Black women to show up, however it works for them. We want to support survivors to engage in the healing process, but recognize that healing is long-term, and the journey to that place looks different for each survivor. Next slide. Next slide, thank you. For Black women to engage in the act of loving themselves fully in a society that deems them and their labor disposable is both countercultural and revolutionary. Thank you,
It most
Umi.
certainly is. Yes, it most certainly is. And with all of the trauma that Black women are experiencing, is there some way in which allies can support Black women, particularly in the legal field? But is there some way that they can receive support from our allies, from women and men, in the legal field. Karma, could you address that for us? Thank you, Condencia, by the way. That was exceptional.
And thank you, Umi, for introducing me. I'm Karma Cotman with UJIMA, which is the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. And one of the things about allyship that's important to note is that we often talk about allyship as if it is a noun, but in all actuality, allyship is truly a verb. It requires action, and it requires self-reflection. And so when we talk about allyship, we talk about it from a couple of different perspectives. So allyship itself, as I said, requires action. It is certainly a lifelong journey. None of us just arrive at being allies. It takes, as we said, self-reflection over a period of time, and the ability to be challenged. Allyship is based on trust, consistency, and accountability. It's not self-defined. So in no way can we ourselves just decide that we are allies. It requires that people from the impacted communities, so women of color, LGBTQI communities, folks that are disabled, etc., consider individuals as allies. And it requires that we seek to be educated about and understand the reality of people's lives and people's experiences. So one of the important things to think about when we talk about allies is all of the context and context in which all of the previous speakers introduced to us today. Thinking through intersectionality, talking about and understanding trauma, and particularly the trauma in Black women's lives. Thinking about the intersections of sexual assault, sexual harassment, violence against Black women, our historical journey, and the impact of historical trauma, community trauma, and what that does to our daily lives today. And so, next slide. So Condencia walked us through some important statistics on Black women, and I'm not going to revisit them. We just have a couple of slides that highlight the impacts of sexual assault, stalking, and next slide, and trafficking on particularly Black women. Next slide. But today we want to talk a little bit more about sexual harassment. And one of the things to highlight is that in 1996, African American women were 1.7 times as likely as white women to report sexual harassment to the EEOC. But in 2000, we were 3.8 times more likely to do so. The likelihood that an individual white woman will report sexual harassment to the EEOC dropped by more than 70% between 1996 and 2016. During that same time, the rate for African American women dropped by only 36%. The researchers, Casino, who identified this research and conducted these studies, identified the reason for these numbers. And what they highlighted is that sexual harassment is not decreasing in the workplace. And it's not decreasing as it relates to white women. It's not decreasing as it relates to Black women. But what is happening is that men are more selective. And they're basing those selection on who they perceive as having power in the workplace. And particularly that they perceive that Black women have little power at all in the workplace. And much of that is built on all of the reasons that the speakers before highlighted. That we have perceptions of Black women and how we show up as angry Black women, how our trauma shows up, and then that Black women ourselves can be silenced. And we've seen this happen time and time again, historically and today in the workplace. Next slide. That intersectionality equals increased vulnerability. And for those reasons, you see Black women having increased rates of poverty, increased rates of health disparities, mental health challenges, educational disparities, poverty, the criminal legal system itself being challenged by race and class, that there is multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression, plus the absence of opportunity to heal or access the benefits available in society, equal increased vulnerability. And it's important to highlight that because it comes together when we talk about allyship. That it's important to highlight that the structural and institutional violence do exist, and that racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, and transphobia, as you've heard today, impact particularly Black women. That the industrial prison complex, the juvenile justice system, and the school to prison pipeline are examples of that. And so why do we talk about that when we talk about allyship? We talk about it because allyship is critical as a verb, and as I talked about before, it's critical for us to understand that if we want to be allies, that we have to address and we have to obstruct racism. We have to talk about classism. We have to talk about sexism. We have to believe women of color when they say they are experiencing racism, sexism, classism, that we have to know that Black women particularly experience all of these issues at disproportionate rates. And why that's important as attorneys, as part of the legal network, as we're doing outreach, as we're providing services to Black women, because it's important that all of those, whether it's legal remedies, outreach, services, are rooted in the context of those experiences of the individuals that we are seeking to serve. And particularly for Black women, that we ensure that we have remedies that focus on economics, that focus on structural violence, that focus on addressing systemic challenges faced by the Black community. When we look at why this is important, we've got research that talks about how the FBI has acknowledged the presence of racial bias in policing, that the rate of incarceration for Black women is still more than twice that of white women, that Black women ages 18 to 19 are 5 times as likely to be incarcerated as white women, and that trans women of color are 67% of LGBTQ homicide victims. And it's important to realize that stereotypes, particularly around the Black community, are ever present. And so we look at implicit and explicit biases. And I always look at this picture of Snoop next to Martha Stewart and recognizing and realizing that only one of them is a convicted felon, and it is not Snoop Dogg, right? And so when we talk about the Black community and our experiences, there are also implicit and very explicit biases that we deal with on a daily basis. And that in order to address and to be a good ally, you have to deal with those microaggressions. Thank you. And no problem. So when we think about allyship, the idea that allyship is certainly a lifelong journey is critical, but also the idea that small actions can equal big impact. Those day-to-day actions where we hold each other accountable as allies, the day-to-day actions where we reinforce the experiences of Black women as they relate to the systems that they are impacted by and the systems that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. That we talk with and educate ourselves, making it clear that it is not the responsibility of oppressed people to educate others about their oppression. It is important to educate yourself and to become familiar with those experiences. So understand that being an ally means you will step in and walk in an uncomfortable place almost every day of your life, because those challenges mean that you take in experiences that are not part of your day-to-day privilege, but that you allow yourselves to be challenged. That being an ally means that you become familiar with privilege and understand that privilege itself is intersectional, and that white women can be actionable allies to people of color. Men can be allies to women. Cis people can be allies to members of the LGBTQI community. And communities and people who are able-bodied can be allies to those who are differently able. That those of us that are economically privileged can be allies to those that are not. And that it's important to remain in community with individuals who are different, communities with those individuals that have different experiences. and that we understand that on this lifelong journey, we are to be challenged. Umi?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Karma, for that exhilarating presentation. And I must say, pulling it together and looking at ways that we are able to support those who are being marginalized, even within those different categories of our identity. So we may be all Black women, yes, but we can also find ways that we can support others who are more marginalized than what we are in different areas. And so that would not only go for Black women, that would go for everyone in our communities. All people can find people to be good allies to. So I appreciate your exceptional presentation around those issues. And you know, I was thinking here that as we're talking about this issue of allyship and justice for women, and sometimes we hear that issue of trying to find, how do we envision justice for Black women? How do we look for that? And what does it mean for us to have different forms of justice? Tanya, could you tell us a little bit about what restorative justice would be and look like?
Sure. If we could go to the next slide, please.
Is it this one?
No. Keep going forward. Yes. Oh, no, keep going. I do just want to say for this one, I think it's important to look at, just take a second to mention that that there was a study done in 2018 that was revisiting the Jezebel stereotype that really spoke to use eye tracking as well as measured implicit bias, and found that that study participants really found themselves looking at Black women's body parts, particularly their hips, their waist, and their chest, more relative to white women, as well as the associations to animals for Black women were much greater than they were with white women, thus reinforcing again the objectification and dehumanization of Black women. But my slides are further towards the end, and I do apologize. They were after Karma's. There's just one slide after Karma's, please. I'm sorry, hello?
Sorry, we're just trying to switch. We're trying to go forward without going through the whole thing again.
Oh, okay. And it should be hopefully right after there. Yes. So what does restorative justice look like? Quickly, that it, when it comes to the dehumanization and objectification of Black women overall, and for all of the wonderful things that have already been shared by all of the presenters today, that it's important that that justice look like that you are doing your own research, that you're taking historical trauma into consideration when working with Black women and girls. You're doing the work to understand and include intersectionality, to truly get that Black women and girls are targets for their race, class, and gender simultaneously. That identity is wrapped up in a very specific way, that Black women and girls are targeted, and that it means seeing our humanity, believing our stories and claims, and trusting the voices and experiences of Black women. And I will pass it back to you, Umi.
Thank you very much. I don't see questions that were asked. Did anyone turn in any questions on your end? Anna, are there questions that you can see that we could quickly answer?
Okay, let me take a look. It looks like it hasn't opened up for questions yet. So if anybody does have questions, please feel free to send them over to me and I can ask the group.
Yeah. If you have any questions that you would like to ask of our panelists, now is a good time for us to do that. And in the meantime, we want to go back to Jaribu and see, can you connect what the other ladies were saying, the other presenters were saying, with what was happening historical? with Black women?
Yes, you know, I'm glad you circled back to me, and I want to say to my sisters, this has just been amazing, incredible, revolutionary conversation that can take us to higher heights if we're willing to go there. It's amazing to have these young and powerful revolutionary voices centered in this conversation. I want you to know I'm so proud. I can just jump out of my phones here. I wish we were face to face so we could do the group hugs and, you know, just really feel each other and touch each other. I did want to lift up a few other names since we started really getting deep into race, class, and gender. And I know that the scholarship still lags behind, including the triple oppression of Black women. And I asked a scholar who is a very close friend of mine, someone who I consider to be really brilliant and revolutionary, why she thought that was. And she said, because some people find class very difficult to deal with. And I think that what she was saying, without saying all of it, is that if your class privilege is in the way, then often you will not want to discuss class. And I think we have to deal with the ways, the full range of ways that Black women are accosted every day. And when we look at the history of our oppression, we have always been the mules, we've always been taking care of other people's children. It's already been said that we have been relied upon to cradle civilization, actually, to really, really make those who are animalistic and inhumane, make them more civilized, to nurture them in ways that their own mothers and fathers could not. So the history of Black women playing that role and carrying the yoke, and that yoke is definitely not easy, is a history that's steeped in many, many great scholarly works. And I will cite some of those artists, and I call them artists because their works are works of art. Flo Kennedy, Bell Hooks, Pauli Murray is a must. There's a poem that she wrote to the oppressor, which is just kind of a mantra for me. When I open up and I start talking about Pauli Murray and how that sister really understood, don't classify me, don't define me, don't put me in one of your boxes, because I'm going to break out, I'm going to climb out of those boxes. And I think Black women historically have had to do that, had to suffer through definitions and descriptions that were not ours in the making, and that were not ours to even control or decide if we wanted to edit them or delete them altogether. So I just see us coming full circle, having talked about areas that are very difficult for some. I see this table bringing it straight to the fore, and it's nothing but a revolutionary happening. So I just applaud you. I really am very inspired by this opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much. And believe me, we were very inspired by your presentation as well. And thank you for contributing that last thought also. And, you know, even with that, as I think about it, you know, and we talk about bell hooks and how they memorialize all of the things that have happened to Black women, and Condencia's presentation about trauma. But
Yes.
what is it that Black women need to do in order to move toward healing? So we talked about some coping skills that we may have that may be positive, or, you know, in some ways may be very negative. Are there any recommendations or strategies that you would have? Condencia, I'll start with you, but if someone else has some thoughts on what are some strategies for Black women to be able to heal.
Thank you, Umi. I know we have a short amount of time, so I'll say it really quickly. I mean, I think one of the things that is so important is to be able to speak out about the abuse. I think many of us as Black women live in silence with the assault that has happened, and is struggling to be able to tell someone. And I think even if you're telling, you know, a friend, if you're telling, you know, someone who, you know, a trusted friend, a sister friend, etc., that's an important step to take. We talk about this concept of you, your best friend, of me. The fact that so many of us have been impacted, but oftentimes are searching for someone to talk to. So I think one of the first steps is talking to someone, finding someone who you know that you trust, value, and telling them about it, however much you want to share, but share.
Very good. Excellent. Anyone else want to make a comment on that?
And I would say find sisters who are feeling what you're feeling and are not going to call you crazy and not going to say, oh, you know, you're just too much, you need to tone it down. Find people who allow you to be who you are and embrace that, not shun it. Because a lot of times, even in our movements, and I think it's class-based when someone looks at me and they look like me and they think I'm too much. I think that's a class issue. I'll say it. I really do. I think the privilege of judging me is your class privilege. So really finding sisters who are just like you. And that's your circle. That's your circle. I used to think, oh, do everything in United Front. No, we need to close ranks and do some cadre work with people who think like we think. And my doors are open. I'm in the Mississippi Delta. No one wants to come down here, but I will host you. We can figure it out. I promise you, I'll meet you in the middle. I'll meet you in Memphis and then take you to Mississippi. But I'd like to continue this at some point, Umi and others. I'd love to continue this in person.
Well, you know, I'm going to find a way to get to Mississippi. I'm in Detroit, but I love the South. And so I may be taking you up on that. And thank you so much. And we're coming to a close for this presentation. And yeah. Mm-hmm. Did someone say
go
something?
ahead.
Oh.
Sorry, go ahead.
All right. We're coming to a close for our presentation. We have 1 minute left. And so I want to go back and again thank the Legal Network for Gender Equity for their support and all that they did. I want to thank the Girls for Gender Equity and the National Black Workers Center Project. I want to thank the National Women's Law Center and Time's Up Legal Defense Fund for their support and making sure that we can hear these voices of these very prominent and distinguished women that we have on our webinar today. So thank you so much, Karma Cotman with the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Thank you so much, Jarubu Hill, of the Executive Director of the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights. And thank you so much, Tanya Lovelace, with the Women of Color Network. We truly appreciate all of your wise words and your wisdom, and we look forward to part 2, March 5th, 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. I'd like to thank my audience for joining us today and staying with us for the full time. And we will be signing off. Oh, additionally, if you do have questions, feel free to send them to in care of the National Women's Law Center, and we will make sure that we can get to those on the next webinar that we have. Thank you very much, and we are now ending this presentation.